Okay, we're going to talk about the Urban League, and then we'll end it with the Armenia Conference. Okay, now, like I asked with NAACP, I usually ask, what do students know about the NAACP? What do students know about the National Urban League? And typically you've heard of these organizations, etc., but you don't necessarily know a whole lot about them, or even recognize their longevity, since both of them have celebrated centennial anniversaries. And yes, as a people, as a race, the African American population community has progressed a long way, and these two particular organizations have assisted it. And a lot of people feel that is there really a need, unfortunately, for such organizations to still exist. I'll let you decide that for yourself, but I will give you some background information to hopefully help an informed decision. Okay, the Urban League. The Urban League is actually a combination of three different organizations. You had the Committee on Urban Conditions. This was founded about 1906. The Committee for the Improvement of Industrial Conditions Among Negroes in New York, founded about 1905. And the National League for the Protection of Colored Women. And so a year after the NAACP will emerge to address black social and political concerns, the National League on Urban Conditions, or what we know simply as the National Urban League, will form. Okay. It will be founded in New York City. It will be part of a social and welfare organization. It will be founded in part because Washington will want a response to the NAACP, even though we know that the organizer of the NAACP did reach out to Booker T. Washington. Oswald V.R. Garrison, as I mentioned previously, was an acquaintance of Washington's. But again, Washington was not a supporter of that particular effort. So he will talk to Ruth Standish Baldwin. And Ruth Standish Baldwin was the widow of the railroad magnate tycoon William H. Baldwin. And he'll contact her and encourage her to help found the National Urban League. Okay, now even as I say that it's founded in part as Washington's response to the NAACP, don't put too much emphasis necessarily that it was a proponent of Booker T. Washington's ideals or ideas, although you can see some things incorporated into it. You also have a huge influence of the colored women's clubs that you'll see in the National Urban League. Okay, but it will be a national organization that will link local community centers. And if you want something to compare the Urban League with, you can think of the settlement houses that had come about. And these settlement houses assisted European immigrants as they came to America. And the goal of the settlement houses in particular was often to Americanize these new immigrants. And when I say Americanize, I always like to ask, what does that mean, to Americanize somebody? And see that sometimes look at me with blank faces. But to Americanize somebody, basically in this regard, means that one would forget their ideas of home, okay, the culture of home, home being their native country, and would assimilate, okay, into what would be considered or regarded as American culture, whatever that might be. Okay, and the reason why I say whatever that might be is because that was typically a European, westernized standard of what American culture was. Okay, when I say they forget their ideals and ideas, etc. of home, okay, I mean that language, okay, maybe certain foods and this type of stuff, okay, and one becomes quote unquote an American. Okay, and so that's what the settlement houses did to assist European immigrants, and there was actually a whole idea and program behind Americanization. Okay, and again, that was the process of leaving one's ethnic and or racial roots behind and becoming more American. Okay, so the National Urban League assisted blacks as they moved from rural areas, from the southern states, etc., into urban areas. Okay, as the migration began and spread, basically. Branches were established in Chicago, Detroit, these early branches, Cleveland, St. Louis, Philadelphia, and Pittsburgh. Okay, a huge concern will be with housing, recreational facilities, and also the relationship of black people to organized labor. Again, the Urban League was very much concerned with this adjustment that new African American migrants made while they were moving in to these city areas. Okay, and here's a quote. A goal was to alleviate conditions black people encountered as they moved into large cities in ever-increasing numbers in the early 20th century. Okay, now to illustrate this, I'm going to read something from your Constant Struggle book. And just follow along with me. Okay, it's on page 426, and it's called Helpful Hints for Migrants to Detroit. Don't carry on loud conversations or use vulgar or obscene language on the streets, or in public places. Remember that this hurts us as a race. Don't go about the streets or on the streetcar in bungalow aprons, boudoir caps, and house slippers. Wear regular street clothes when you go into the streets. Try to dress neatly at all times, but don't be a dude or wear flashy clothes. They are as undesirable and as harmful as unclean clothes. Don't think you can hold your job unless you are on time, industrious, efficient, and sober. Don't sit in front of your house or around Belle Isle or public places with your shoes off. Don't wear overalls on Sunday. Don't stay away from work every time someone gives a picnic or a boat ride. Stay on your job, others do. Don't spend all your money for pleasure. Save some of it for extra clothing and fuel for the winter and to take care of your family and yourself when sickness comes. Don't forget that cleanliness and fresh air are necessary to good health. Keep your windows open. Don't do your children's hair up into alleys, canals, and knots if you don't want other children to make fun of them. Keep them clean. Don't keep your children out of school. See that they attend the nearest school to you. Don't fail to start a savings account with some good bank or building loan association. Don't throw refuse and tin cans in your back or front yards. Keep your surroundings as clean as possible. This makes for good health. Don't fool with patent medications in case of sickness. Send for a good doctor. In case you have no money, go to some of the Board of Health clinics. Don't be rude and ugly to people on the streets. Be courteous and polite and thereby keep out of trouble. Don't fail to meet the teachers of your children. Keep in touch with them. Every hateful thing that your child says about the teacher is not true. That still holds true for today. Okay. Don't fail to become connected with some church as soon as you get into the city. And don't make lots of unnecessary noise going to and from baseball games. If the parks are taken away from you, it will be partly your own fault. And you can see at the bottom where it identifies the source of this is called Helpful Hints Leaflet, Detroit Urban League. Okay, and the date is from 1918. So it's part of the first wave of the Great Migration. Now, sometimes students don't understand all the things that these helpful hints are prescribing. Okay, some of them are very obvious. Okay, when they're talking about going into the street or on the streetcars in bungalow aprons, boudoir caps, and house slippers, okay, back in the day, obviously, it was, it made one look very coarse, okay, like somebody did not have any home training, etc., if they went outside in their pajamas. And I know some people do it as a fad today, okay, but to certain generations it still looks like the person is unkempt and has no home training, okay. And so when they're talking about bungalow aprons, that would be akin to if you know what a house dress is today, or something similar, okay. And the boudoir cap, that would be, you know, like when people wear stocking caps or wave caps or something like that. You could compare that to that, and obviously house slippers or house slippers. Okay. Okay, some of the other advice that's given. The thing about don't do your children's hair up into alleys, canals, and knots. That does not mean cornrows. Okay. A lot of people always say, "Oh, that just means cornrows." No. Cornrows were the standard, you know, the norm for black children. But they mean would have been really kind of elaborate type styles. There was a derogatory name used in minstrelsy for the pickaninny, and these were like the little children. And the best thing that I can always relate it to today, if y'all know the music artist Coolio, okay, and like some of the styles that he has worn his hair, something akin to that, not just, you know, regular cornrows or anything like that. Okay, now I always ask students, okay, these helpful hints for migrants to Detroit, why would they put something out that, you know, something like this up there? And what would your thoughts of something like this be? When you have these migrants that were going into these large cities, remember, over 90% of black people lived in the South. So when we were having these waves of black migration, you had black people coming into areas where there were either, you know, few black people or possibly none. Okay, in a lot of places you already had these established black communities, but they weren't a huge part, a huge demographic of the larger society. So you have these migrants that are coming in, and they are swelling the ranks, so to speak. Okay, so people did not distinguish between what black people had been there and what black people were coming in. To them, everybody was just a black person. Okay, and so when you look at something like these helpful hints for migrants to Detroit, you should see some classism there, and you should see some elitism. Okay. The black people who are already there, they didn't want any negative light to be shown upon them because of anything that the new migrants brought with them. And when I say anything that the new migrants brought with them, basically I'm saying their, you know, rural or country ways, because that's how it was looked at. Okay, so when you look at something like this document, you should see some elitism and some classism woven in. Okay, but still, again, the idea was not necessarily to hurt, but to help, okay, to help the race as a whole. But particularly, again, in something like this, not to shed negative light on the entire black population. Okay, so you have programs that were started for meeting migrants, directing them to jobs, also places to live, And again, as we just saw, basic information on how to live in the big bad city. Okay? As I mentioned, in a lot of ways, the Urban League workers helped to ease that transition and adjustments that migrants needed to make, okay, as they moved from, home, the only place that they knew, to these new environments. The League is also going to look out for delinquent children, and one thing you may or may not know is that it helped to start the Big Brother Big Sister program. Now, some historians, namely Claiborne Carson is one, feel that the Urban League was the most overtly political of the early 20th century organizations. Now you can take that or you can leave it. Okay, that's just a thought. Okay, and the reason why some people feel this way is because, number one, it was linked with the progressives and the progressive movement. But like we already talked about, with the progressives, some progressive organizations, or what one would consider a progressive organization, could be very racist. Okay, but for black, it was linked with the progressives in terms of black progressives. A reason why they thought that it was very political is because it encouraged black people to vote. In the North, there were not the restrictions placed upon black voters as there was in the South. They also encouraged people to join unions, okay, and demand equal services from local governments. And if you look at these things, they seem what? Very political. Okay, so you can see why people would think that. Now, these are where we go with some of the differences of the Urban League as compared to the NAACP. It was seen as being more democratic. And the reason why it was seen as being more democratic than the NAACP is because it made, or seemingly made more of an effort to reach out to all classes of African Americans. Okay. Now, I say that because remember when we talked about the NAACP, you will have some people that will call it the National Association for the Advancement of Certain People rather than the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Okay? And there were the charges, again, that the NAACP was under white leadership, depended upon white funding, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? But we did see, some of the transition in the NAACP and how, even though it started out as an interracial organization, it increasingly becomes more black-oriented. Okay? Now, go back to the Urban League. By 1915, the National Urban League has started collecting annual statistics on housing and employment on blacks in the city. Even today, it still puts out its annual report on the conditions of African Americans, so people can see if any progression has been made year to year, and also see how far African Americans still need to go. Okay, let me go back to this before I go into Booker T. Washington and the Du Bois and the immediate conference. Again, the National Urban League is going to help to solidify the whole idea of professional social workers. Okay, any of you who are social work majors, the National Urban League will help to promote that as a profession. Okay. Again, the Urban League will help to improve housing, medical care, and recreational facilities for black people moving into the city. And by the end of World War I, you've had Urban League locations in over 30 cities. Okay? Now, a couple more points before we move on.
Recording started.
Okay, so as I mentioned before, a lot of the programs that the Colored Women's Clubs were promoting, they will be incorporated into Urban League initiatives. Okay, the daycares and the help for working mothers and this type of stuff. The Urban League will take up many of those initiatives. Also, another thing that we should remember, and we'll get more into this when we talk about the Great Migration, but again, as Black people are moving into these areas, they're moving into what become basically de facto segregated areas. Okay, you have racial groups living in certain areas, you have ethnic groups living in various areas, and if you compare immigration and migration, there are some similarities, and again, we'll go into greater detail when we talk about the Great Migration. But you'll have family members who will encourage Black people to move, to where they have moved. Just like with immigrants, you'll have family members that will write home, talking about where they've moved, etc. And they'll write to their friends and things like that, so that you'll have various people from the same village, who come and move to the same place. And the reason why they move to the same place is because they know somebody there. Okay, they're not going there, completely alone. Okay, so just keep that in mind as we move forward. The things about people being there to meet migrants when they come and this type of stuff, that stuff is very important, because in many cases you had scams, which we talked about before. People are lured up north or lured into these urban areas with the thought of a job, okay, but it's actually not an employment agency at all. It's just a con person, who takes somebody's money, and they spend all their money on trying to secure a job and transportation and everything, and they get there, and the employment agency doesn't exist. And when that happens, with the women's clubs in particular, they would have people there to meet the young women so that they wouldn't fall prey to people who would rather do them harm than good. Okay, so we're moving on to the Armenia Conference, and your book has a document from it, and it says the Armenia Conference. That is a typo. Okay, Armenia is where the Kardashian clan is from. Okay, but Armenia is the country, a state of Joel Spengler, which we'll get into in just a second. Okay, so with the death of Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois is going to realize that, now this huge obstacle has been removed, so there's the possibility to bring together these very disparate Black factions. Okay, so these people who have differing ideas and opinions, etc., try to bring them all together. In deference to Booker T. Washington, because he realizes, or realized rather, that again, Booker T. Washington was a very important man to African Americans, even though they did not always see eye to eye. Okay, so he's going to postpone the annual NAACP meeting because it will have fallen on the same day as the memorial that Tuskegee would be giving to Washington. So he postpones that because he realized that some people would be attending the other. And he also comes up with this idea to propose a meeting for Black leaders. And he wants to do this in order to help to reconcile any differences among them. And so they will call this the Armenia Conference. And it will be held in August of 1916. Okay? And again, it was called Armenia, not Armenia, because the name of the country estate of Joel Spingarn, who was Du Bois's closest white male friend, that country estate's name was Armenia. Okay, and that's a picture of Joel Spingarn. And, you know, me in trivia often ask students, well, you know, where have you heard the name Spingarn? And some people will say a high school, that's true. And some people, hopefully, will also say Moreland Spingarn Library over at Howard University. Okay? And again, those will be named after the Spingarn family. Now, Spingarn will send out the invitations, and he does this on purpose so that it did not seem like this was solely a Du Bois effort to move in now that Washington was no longer among us. Du Bois is going to divide the people invited into 3 categories. He'll call them Niagara men, Washington men, and then the 3rd category will be questionable. Okay, there'll be more Du Bois allies than any other group, and the purpose will be to gloss over hurts and enmities and to bring about as large a degree as possible of unity of purpose among Negro leaders. Okay, Du Bois would write of the 3-day event that none of us held uncompromising and unchangeable views. It was all a matter of emphasis. We all believed in thrift. We all wanted the Negro to vote. We all wanted the laws enforced. We all wanted assertion of our essential manhood. But how to get these things, there, of course, was infinite divergence of opinion. Okay? So, again, if you want to look at the formal initiatives of the Armenia Conference, you can look in your Constant Struggle book. Let me make sure I have the right page. And it's on page 383, and the date is wrong. Okay, it's 1916, so I don't know why that happened. Okay, now, what the conference did establish, it established a truce among black leaders. It also marked a shift in power with black leadership. At the time, with the death of Booker T. Washington, the Tuskegee machine will be on its last legs, and you see in parentheses there I have from what it had been. Okay, Tuskegee is still going to be an important cog in the wheel for some time after, but you know, without the personality and the guidance of Booker T. Washington, it will be on its last legs from what it had been. Okay, and the NAACP will become more pronounced and more dominant, and the philosophies espoused by the NAACP and strategies, etc., will be what, again, more people will be embracing. And basically, it will be the more dominant influence. Again, as we talked about, the NAACP moving from, you know, this whole interracial thing to more of a black organization. In 1916, James Weldon Johnson is going to become a national organizer and field secretary of the NAACP. He will later become the first black secretary of the NAACP. Okay. And Johnson will help to grow the numbers of the organization. Okay. So by the end of 1918, there'll be over 40,000 members. Okay. And you see by 1920, there'll be over 60,000 members. And one thing that Johnson will do while he serves as National Field Secretary is he will organize branches in the South. Okay? Before Johnson takes over in this capacity, only branches had been organized in the North. And it's a very radical thing for these branches to be organized in the South, because a huge focus of the NAACP, was the South and African American conditions in the South. Okay, so when he organizes branches in the South, this is a huge thing, and the membership in the South under his leadership and tutelage will actually grow and exceed that of the membership of blacks in the North. Okay, and in the South, in many cases, it will be very dangerous to be a member of the NAACP. Okay, so we're thinking about, comparisons and things with the Urban League and the NAACP. Some people say, okay, well, again, NAACP, it had this big focus on the South, whereas the Urban League looked at black people moving into urban areas, in the North in particular, during this time. Yeah, you could say things like that. Both of them were working towards what? Okay, towards bettering conditions for African Americans, because in the North, what do I always say, the South did not have a monopoly on racism or discrimination. And in these de facto areas, they weren't segregated by law, but they were segregated by custom. And so when you have black people moving into these areas, they are basically going to be the beginnings of urban ghettos. And we'll discuss more of that when we talk about the Great Migration. Okay, that's it for now.